This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Just before the November election, an error was spotted in Spanish language instructions for Hartford's ballot. To make sure this was corrected before November 7th, election officials included an additional piece of paper with the ballot that had the correct instructions in Spanish. Advocates have said the error underscores the language access issues many Connecticut residents face and the different kinds of Spanish language mis- and disinformation there are to tackle. Coming up, we'll hear about how one news outlet enlisted more than 100 Latino immigrants in disinformation defense and what they learned about how disinformation operates. But first, here to discuss the important role state and local governments play, particularly as the 2024 election approaches, is Dr. Charles Venator. He's the faculty director for UConn's Puerto Rican Studies Initiative and director of El Instituto, the Institute of Latino, Caribbean, and Latin American Studies. Welcome back to Where We Live, Charles.
Thank you. Good morning.
And with us also is Nellie Gorbea. She's a visiting senior fellow on cybersecurity at the Pell Center and the former Secretary of State of Rhode Island. Thank you so much, Nellie, for being with us today.
Good morning.
And for our listeners, you can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So Nellie, we'd love to start with you if you can help us begin with defining some terms for us. How would you distinguish the differences between mis, dis, and even malinformation?
Yes, thanks. And I think this is really important because there's different ways in which false information is being promoted and distributed. So misinformation is information that's false, but it's not created to cause harm. So there was a post that was sent out with, polling locations, but there was a typo in it and there was a mistake because it happened to be a special election and they've changed polling locations. There was no intent to do harm. That's misinformation because it's misinformed. Disinformation is false information that was deliberately created to cause harm. So, and this predates the era of social media and the internet. I mean, back in the old days, it was flyers put into neighborhoods, with, purposely containing, wrong information or allegations that were, invented and things like that. More recently, it could be like, purposely sending out the wrong date for when an election is being held, right? So that's disinformation because there's actually an intent to cause harm. And then malinformation is the information that's based on reality, but it's been distorted and altered to cause harm. So social media posts with, fake videos or incorrectly claiming that election day has technical difficulties at the polls, and it's done on purpose. It's created on purpose, altering actual reality to make it so that you suppress the vote. So this mis, dis, and malinformation. And whenever I run into a problem remembering what each of them are, I recommend people go to the National Association of Latino Elected Officials. NALEO's educational fund has a great program called Defiende la Verdad, Defend the Truth, and they actually break it down for you.
Well, that's excellent advice. Thank you so much for adding that to our arsenal of information. And Charles, I want to ask, so it sounds like this ballot typo in Hartford could be qualified as misinformation. What was your reaction to that incident? What was going through your mind when you first heard about it?
Well, thank you. And this is really helpful, by the way, this list of terms. Two things were going on. One is that it's 2023. We've had several Puerto Rican mayors. We have a president of the city council is Puerto Rican, Malí Rosado. So you have a large population of Puerto Ricans, and it doesn't make any sense that at this stage, this ballot error should have happened. And it took a while, took public sort of denunciation to correct at least that part of the ballot issue. My concern is, and I think I agree, this is a form of misinformation, is that Puerto Rican voters and Latino voters in general may be discouraged from participating when they see these types of typos, and it sort of sends a message that the city government doesn't care that much for voters. And when we have low voter turnout, this can contribute to discouraging higher participation.
And Nellie, sort of as a follow-up, I would actually like to ask for your reactions about this typo as well, using it as a kind of example of the issue that we're talking about. And also, if you can talk about the important role of government here, actually.
Yeah. Well, as a Latina elected official, and I was actually the first Latina elected at statewide office in New England, what I would always convey to people is, would that mistake have happened in in English? Would that mistake have happened in English? If somebody preparing the ballots had seen that kind of gobbledygook on ballot instructions, would it have gone through all that? It might have, but the fact is that elections require an incredible amount of attention to detail because you're talking about people's voting rights. And so anything that's less than perfect, and this is one of the big hurdles and challenges of running elections, is there is no fail. Like, there is no time to fail. There is no mistake that's allowed within an election. And so it has the highest level of scrutiny and accountability. And I agree, with Charles that this is probably misinformation. It was not created to cause harm, but the lack of attention to detail in another language, which happens to be Spanish, which happens to be a huge language in the Hartford area, is of concern because it speaks to the institutions, the offices' lack of attention to detail to that community, to basically upholding the rights that community has to receive correct information.
And so I want to ask you both this question, especially with this example happening so recently, but Charles, what are some of the solutions you would propose, especially around translation services for state agencies?
Well, let me just say, when you look at the individual ballots, and here in Connecticut, every town clerk is or city clerk is responsible for this ballot. The rest of Connecticut didn't have a problem. This is a problem in Hartford, which has the largest concentration of Puerto Ricans and Latinos in the state. No, I think there has to be some sort of check and balance where town clerks and the Secretary of State are double check. It's that simple with clear translators. However, let me just say, one of the big complaints that we're hearing, we're conducting a lot of focus groups and listening sessions throughout the state, is there's a lack of competent, available translators and interpreters in the state. This is a general complaint throughout the state that we're listening. So I wonder whether the state is investing enough resources in having competent translators and interpreters available for these kinds of sort of ballot initiatives.
And on what you just said, Charles, are there other states we can look to have that has offered provisional licenses for translators?
So I haven't studied that carefully, but I know Nebraska had an initiative several years ago to start opening licenses across the board for immigrants and undocumented immigrants so they can participate in the economy. But I haven't looked at that question carefully.
Nellie, I want to follow up with you on this too. What are your thoughts about this in terms of other solutions that you'd propose?
No, well, so in Rhode Island, in my office, and unlike Connecticut, my office, right, when I was Secretary of State, is actually responsible for preparing all ballots in the state. And there are like over 400 different ballot styles by the time you get to a full-blown presidential election cycle. This is where I tell people, diversity is good. So we have personnel at the Department of State who are fully bilingual. And by that, I don't mean just verbally bilingual, because for something like a ballot accuracy, you need to have somebody who is fully bilingual in Spanish and English. We are fortunate in Rhode Island that the only other language really that passes the voting rights threshold is Spanish. There are jurisdictions where, it's a dozen different languages. I mean, the city of New York is, or somewhere like LA has a much higher burden to deal with. But Connecticut and Rhode Island have a fairly low burden to deal with, and a wealth of population that can absolutely be recruited into these jobs. And I'm not saying just hire somebody to be the interpreter. No, that when you open up positions, whether it be your deputy secretary of state, whether it's your deputy assistant in the elections office, that some real serious recruitment happens in communities that can help fill those gaps. In this case, the Latino, Spanish-speaking community. Those people are out there. They can be found, but you have to go beyond the usual networks that you've been posted jobs in to get those people recruited and into the pipeline and then evaluated so that you hire the right person. So, I mean, none of this is rocket science, to be honest.
Right. And Charles, we know you're working on an oral history project around Puerto Rican Day parades here in Connecticut. And through that, you actually discovered some pretty surprising evidence of translation services that may have previously been in place. Can you talk about that?
So yes, so we're doing an archive, newspaper archive and oral histories archives of all the Puerto Rican Day parades in the state of Connecticut since the 1950s, although they started in the 1960s. And what we found early on is particularly for sponsored migration, mostly from Puerto Rico, that city government and state government were working with companies to provide interpreters and translators, and they were partially funding translators and interpreters all across the board. So there was a more active involvement by the state government and city government to help with translation services. And that sort of faded away over the past couple decades. So now it's a sort of more you're on your own, or if the company has its own resources, it will address it. The other challenge that we're finding is that we're not seeing enough translators and interpreters available in state agencies or around, even though, again, Connecticut has a really high population, almost a fifth of the population is Spanish speaking in the state of Connecticut. But for some reason, that hasn't been a priority here in the state.
And Nellie, as you continue to sort of process this, you also recently hosted a workshop for Latino elected officials in Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts to address mis, dis, and malinformation. Can you tell us about this workshop? And can you also share, what are some of the takeaways that you got from this?
Sure. No, thanks. Yeah, in last June, over at the Pell Center at Salve Regina University, we brought together elected officials from throughout the region, from Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, to talk about this important issue of mis, dis, and malinformation. The genesis of it came out of my own lessons learned as Secretary of State during one of the most challenging times in our democracy, the 2016 federal election and its aftermath. And I was leaving office. I was term limited, and I thought, okay, I can't have what I've learned basically stop with me, so that what Charles speaks to doesn't happen, which is, we have to reinvent wheels. And so I thought, okay, let me hold this workshop and share the knowledge about the dangers to our democracy about this, and what are the tools that are available. And so we had a full day event. We had people from NALEO, from the Educational Fund. We had a media literacy professor from the University of Rhode Island, Renee Hobbs, Dr. Pablo Rodriguez, who is an expert on public health and has an actual website called Nuestra Salud, which is a medical information website. And it was funded by the Hispanic Federation. We had the Latino Victory Fund as well supporting. From Connecticut, we have your own Stephen Hernandez, Executive Director for the Commission on Women, Children, and Seniors. And it was really important to be able to convey what are the issues, what are the problems, and then what are potential solutions that the community, other elected leaders can take on to prevent this kind of situation from happening.
And as you mentioned, you did not want your experience to stop when you ended your term as Rhode Island's Secretary of State. Can you talk about how that experience informed some of the strategies and resources you shared during that workshop? And your term was between 2015 and 2023, so that included 2 presidential elections and also at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes, it was a fun time to be chief state election.
That's one way to put it.
It was very interesting. I had come into the office as having been a former Deputy Secretary of State and having had a lifelong interest in civic engagement. So I thought I knew pretty much what I was heading into when I became elected Secretary of State. The 2016 election really put that notion to rest. In 2017, the outgoing Obama administration suddenly announced that they were making elections critical infrastructure. None of us knew what that meant. There was this big flurry. I mean, it was, this is the election where Trump won and Hillary lost, and so everybody's emotions were all raw, and it seemed odd to have an administration try to make something so big happen in the last month. As we got more information, we got to understand why, and it was that when we got together with the intelligence community, and this is a nonpartisan meeting under the sponsorship of the National Association of Secretaries of State, it became very clear that there were foreign actors that had tried to affect the results of the 2016 election and try to sway the population. And so that all gave us the information we needed to try to make sure that we battled things. And some of it was we needed to battle with investments in hardware and software and processes of elections. And there was a big outlay of federal monies for that purpose. But the more challenging situation is this with the mis, dis, and malinformation, because it hits against one of our most cherished rights, which is the freedom of speech, and it really is difficult to counter because you don't want the government to be affecting or somehow influencing what kind of speech is presented. And so it really hits at a sort of an Achilles heel in our democracy. And to me, the solution is education. It's not necessarily combating it head on in terms of what is false information, although there can be some of that happens as examples. But it is like the woman from El Tímpano described. It's kind of like a whack-a-mole. What you really want to do is to really prepare your community to be skeptical, to have media literacy in schools, to be able to say, this is really not sounding totally right, or this is too good to be true. And let me dig a little bit deeper before they hit the forward button on their social media app. And so, that's sort of what's the genesis for me. And it impressed on me the importance of passing this knowledge forward so that we can continue to invest in improving media literacy among immigrant communities. I mean, one of the scariest things that I found was that when I was able to ask social media companies, representatives from Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, about what did they do when they encountered false information, blatantly false information on their programs, there was just silence. And to this day, there is research that shows that false information in English on any of the social media apps gets taken down much more readily than it does in other languages. And I happen to be fluent in Spanish, so that's the one that I know. But that is really worrisome to me. I mean, we had a lot of problems in public health with the pandemic because of false information about the vaccines and what was going on in the community. So this is a real struggle for us in this country.
And we're going to be hearing from El Tímpano in a second, and we'll also talk much more about the media side of things after our break. But Charles, I want to ask you too, especially with what Nellie just said, thinking ahead to the 2024 election, what are some concerns that you have around voting and language access here in Connecticut?
Well, I want to emphasize what Secretary of State Gorbea said, because what we're finding is that at every age group here in Connecticut, particularly, and I suspect it's national, everybody's relying on social media. So they're not reading so much newspapers, which would filter out a lot of this disinformation, but also cable TV is not very popular. And it's a wild west out there in social media. And again, this is really challenging because when you have seniors who are participating at higher rates and younger populations and across the board relying on sort of open access media, you're going to see a lot of conspiracy theories populating and a lot of unchecked information that's flowing. And that's a problem in terms of communicating information about elected officials, particularly in the state of Connecticut, which is what I'm focused on.
And before we go to our break, Nellie, I want to ask your response to Charles. Do you have any concerns about the next election?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think that you can you cannot have concerns. And what's really troubling to me also is that many of these communities are absorbing information from websites and in other languages where foreign governments are actually getting involved in providing dis and malinformation that's being conveyed without proper due diligence or any kind of stopgap to address it. But I have to say, I mean, Connecticut, in many ways, the largest population here that we're talking about are Puerto Ricans, and Puerto Ricans have a right to receiving their voting materials in both Spanish and English, and so it seems to me that a lot more attention needs to be placed to make sure that people are getting, correct information and that they're getting it from trusted sources. That means that government offices need to have people who are multilingual to be able to serve their taxpayers, to serve their communities in an appropriate way.
And really quickly, because you touched on it a little bit just now, but can you talk about how it's important also to fold in other languages beyond Spanish to this conversation?
No, absolutely. I mean, and I get it. I've been in elected office. You can't do every single language out there, but there are rules and there are laws right now on the books, and there's a threshold that the Voting Rights Act provides with regards to providing, for example, election information in another language. And if you have a language speaking community that's fluent in something other than English, then you can guide yourselves by that metric and provide the information that community has absolutely a civil right to.
You've been listening to Nellie Gorbea. She's a visiting senior fellow on cybersecurity at the Pell Center and the former Secretary of State of Rhode Island, as well as UConn's Dr. Charles Venator. Coming up, we'll hear from the founding director of El Timpano about their efforts to tackle disinformation locally. You can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Trusted new outlets play a massive role in countering mis- and disinformation just by doing what we do best. That was what our next guest realized after leading 100-plus Latino immigrants to tackle disinformation. And joining us now to discuss is Madeline Baer. She's the founding director of El Timpano. Timpano is Spanish for eardrum, and the outlet aims to inform, engage, and amplify the voices of the Bay Area's Latino and Mayan immigrants. Thank you so much, Madeline, for joining us today. Madeline, are you there? I'm hearing some sound, but she may not be there, but we're going to check on that real quick. But still with us is Nellie Gorbea. She's a visiting senior fellow on cybersecurity at the Pell Center, as well as Dr. Charles Venator, who is with UConn. And for our listeners, you can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Charles, as we wait for Madeline to come on, can we talk about how important is this community-based approach in thinking about mis- and disinformation?
It's crucial. And let me tie in a really important issue here in Connecticut. Connecticut has a closed election system. So when people arrive to Connecticut, they generally have to register in a political party to participate in the conventions, to identify potential candidates, and then you have to be registered in a political party to participate in primaries. most Puerto Ricans and Latinos tend to be encouraged to identify as independents or unaffiliated, rather, so they don't participate in the conventions or primary process. And to this extent, they end up in the elections without necessarily having general knowledge or in-depth knowledge of the candidates. So this community-based approach is really crucial because it compensates for the lack of political participation of Puerto Rican and Latino electors in this whole year-long process that begins in the spring, culminates in August, and then we have an election. And it's these community-based organizations that oftentimes have the more direct access to address that lack of information, lack of political socialization among electors here in Connecticut.
And really quickly, just want to check if Madeline is on the line. Madeline, are you there?
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Nice to hear you. Sorry that we missed you a little bit earlier, but glad to have you back online. We have Madeline from El Timpano. We just finished up a conversation earlier about the important role that government has in curbing misinformation. So we'd love to get your thoughts about the big picture, about the role that the media plays in addressing misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, thanks for having me part of this conversation. So El Timpano is a civic media organization. All of our strategies have really been designed with and for Latino and Indigenous Mayan immigrants of the San Francisco Bay Area. And I founded it really because I saw there was a big gap in information that serves this community, that, we conducted surveys and listening sessions to really hear from Latino immigrants about what they wanted to see in local media. And the number one response we received from our survey was simply más información, more information. I've heard some of the other guests already speak about this, that when it comes to Latino immigrants and other communities of color across our country, they experience inequitable information, and that goes from everything from lack of translated materials from government agencies, but also, a real lack of local news. I founded El Timpano because, I myself, I'm not Latina. I'm white, I'm college educated, and I married into a Latino immigrant family and saw that, I have so many more options for quality local information than my in-laws. Just because I speak English and I have access to a smartphone and subscribe to digital newsletters. And so, what El Timpano has found, and we really ramped up our work to prevent and address disinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we found that really disinformation thrives in this void and a lack of information. There was in 2021, we reported on a surge of COVID cases that winter. And a mother featured in that story, she had COVID and she was trying her best to isolate in her home. And she told us that she was taking home remedies, essentially a tea to cope with her symptoms because she hadn't received any information from the local public health department. And so she was making this tea that a relative passed to her on WhatsApp. And she told us herself, I know this is probably not the best remedy to address this illness, but it's all the information I have. And so I think that big picture is one of the big takeaways that we've found is, really to address disinformation, we need to provide people with reliable, accessible, and trusted information in the first place.
And so you started this Disinformation Defense Initiative 2 years ago. Can you talk about why it was so important to decentralize the approach?
Yeah, at that point especially, so many efforts to address disinformation really were based on this fact-checking approach of, if we could just fact-check every piece of disinformation that is swirling through our community and let people know that that is not correct and share that around, And, for us, that didn't make sense for a few reasons. First of all, we're a tiny organization, and there is simply no way that we, but also that media outlets much bigger than us could surface and fact check every piece of misinformation that might be circulating among our audiences. But secondly, we were really inspired by this approach of public health education called promotores that was really developed in Latin America and has really taken on popularity among Latino communities in the U.S. And promotoras really, it means essentially ambassadors. And the way it works is really by training community members themselves to be trusted messengers of verified public health information. And so you'll find a lot of community clinics, a lot of community-based organizations have promotoras groups because they recognize that particularly among marginalized communities, there's already either a lack of trust or a lack of relationships with institutions like the government or like medical professionals. And so we were really inspired by the promotoras model and decided, instead of us trying to verify every single piece of misinformation, let's train community members themselves. Let's train the mothers, the neighbors, the teachers, the kind of informal community leaders among our community to themselves be able to identify disinformation. And so that's really how our Comunidades Informadas initiative developed. And so we worked with our own audience, we worked with local community-based organizations and with experts on disinformation to develop a training that really is designed with and for Latino immigrants to provide them with basic understanding of how disinformation works, why it is that their community is targeted with disinformation, and what are some basic steps that they can take to defend their communities and stop the spread of disinformation among their communities.
And so it's about decentralization, but also localization. Madeline, earlier you mentioned the importance of local news and media as well. You recently wrote a piece reflecting on 2 years of running this initiative and included 5 lessons learned. And one of the 5 that you listed is the most common ways people experience disinformation may not be what you think. Can you talk about that more, especially since, we've been talking about elections, we've been talking about pandemic-related disinformation, but it goes way beyond those 2 focuses.
Yeah, that was a really interesting learning from conducting these workshops. In every single workshop, we developed this during COVID because we saw such targeted disinformation, really targeting Latino immigrants in particular. And when we conducted this workshop, the number one question or example that participants brought up in the workshop was consumer fraud. And that's because long before COVID and, much more commonly than electoral disinformation, Latino immigrants have really been targeted by consumer fraud. And it plays out in the same way as public health disinformation or political disinformation. It's really taking advantage of people's vulnerabilities. In this case, a lot of people don't speak English or are afraid to contact police or, again, don't have a trusted source of information where they can go to ask if this is a legitimate source. And so we heard so many people telling us that they've been victims of or nearly victims of consumer fraud that was shared on WhatsApp or just in the mail. And where their identity was stolen or they were provided a false ATM card saying that it had money on it. And so, one thing that we found is using this approach of popular education, of really training people to understand how disinformation takes place, it has benefits well beyond just helping people make informed decisions about public health or to take part in democratic processes, because people start to understand, maybe I'm too quick to believe in this because it's actually designed to make me fall into a trap. And so that was a really interesting learning for us in facilitating these disinformation workshops.
And before we go to our next break, really quickly, Nellie, I would love to get your response to Madeline and her work here.
No, I have to say I was thrilled to learn of Madeline's work and her approach. As somebody remembers promotoras de salud as the go-to tactic of, like the 90s when I was back working at the Rhode Island Foundation. But, there's two things that jump out at me. One is, that the lack of information is real. And so, for example, in Rhode Island, in the public health arena, it led to the creation of an actual website in Spanish called Nuestra Salud. And it came out of all of the misinformation and disinformation and consumer fraud stuff that happened during the pandemic. The other thing that I was struck by is, as I hear Madeline speak, is that for Connecticut in particular, it's a little bit different, right? And as it is in some cases for Rhode Island, in that your largest Latino population is Puerto Ricans. Puerto Ricans are not immigrants, they're U.S. citizens who happen to be, in many cases, fluent in Spanish and not so much in English. And so there's a different dynamic and a set of rights that happens with regards to Puerto Ricans as U.S. citizens versus other communities. But many of the tactics that Madeline is speaking to serve all immigrant communities and all U.S. citizens, right? We all go to those people that we know best to get the information we need. And so the tactic is definitely applicable to immigrant and citizen groups here in our country.
You've been listening to Nellie Gorbea. She's a visiting senior fellow on cybersecurity at the Pell Center. Madeline Baer, who's the founding director of El Timpano, and UConn's Dr. Charles Venator. We'll be continuing this conversation after a quick break. You can also join us. Give us a call at 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, we're discussing Spanish language myths and disinformation and some of the efforts to address it around where we live. Back with us is Dr. Charles Venator. He's with UConn, and Nellie Gorbea. She's a visiting senior fellow on cybersecurity at the Pell Center, and Madeline Baer, who's the founding director of El Timpano. And for our listeners, you can also join the conversation. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Charles, with everything that we've said this hour, we'd love to get your thoughts on the Spanish language media landscape. And can you talk about what are some of the challenges that you're seeing?
Great question. It's really interesting because Connecticut has actually a pretty decent outreach. Yeah, there's a lot of radio outreach. Connecticut Public has an initiative, not just in the state, but also with Puerto Rico, which is really interesting because I get phone calls all the time about reports that happen here in Connecticut from Puerto Rico, because they're in Puerto Rico, in El Nuevo Dia, there's an initiative where they're doing some coverage here in Connecticut and throughout the United States. But one of the challenges that we're finding is that there are great sources in TV, radio, and internet, but a lot of people are still getting their information from social media. And as Secretary of State Gorbea said, sometimes that's coming from outside of the United States in unregulated ways, or at least not careful ways. So we're still seeing a lot of people relying on their phones to get information. And there is a lot of misinformation that's floating around. and a lot of misunderstanding of politics here in the state.
And so Latinos generally have higher than average levels of trust in Spanish language news. What kind of opportunity does that present? And especially with what you just shared, a lot of people who come to the States still rely on the media from their native country. So does that have an impact?
Oh, yes. Well, again, and as Secretary of State Gorbea said, Puerto Rico has, Connecticut has a higher proportion of Puerto Ricans, or the Latino population in the state is primarily Puerto Rican, at least half of them. And they're getting fairly clear information from Puerto Rico as well as Connecticut. My concern is here in Connecticut is that there are all these networks of information sharing that sometimes rely on, again, social media sources that are promoting conspiracies. And I'm not sure how to tackle that one here other than media literacy and keep pushing campaign information. Mm-hmm. But it's really hard.
Right. And yeah, go for it, Nellie.
If I could jump in, I think one of the other insights that I shared from this recent blog on what we've learned addressing disinformation is, it's not only our popular education model, but I think what has really made an impact for El Tímpano in addressing disinformation among our audience is that our primary platform for providing information in Spanish is really a two-way communications platform. We primarily use text messaging to reach our audience of Spanish-speaking immigrants. And what that means is that not only can we provide information, and in 2021 in particular, so much of our work was really just to help people navigate the COVID-19 pandemic. Next year, certainly we'll be focused a lot on the election. But not only were we able to provide in that period information about, the latest public health policies, the status of vaccinations, but we were also able to respond to people's questions and invite people to ask us questions. And in 2021 alone, we answered more than 1,500 questions from our subscribers. And I really think of that as preventative, like a way to prevent disinformation, because so many of the questions were really about personal health issues that weren't otherwise addressed in general public health campaigns. And so if our subscribers didn't have a source to go to ask those questions, and many told us they may not have gotten a COVID-19 vaccine because they simply had lingering questions that were keeping them from getting vaccinated. And through our two-way communications platform, we were able to provide them a source to ask and to find answers. So I think that's one other aspect of, just how media can innovate to address disinformation and kind of try to fill that void of information that otherwise disinformation can easily fill.
And Nellie, with what Madeline just shared, especially with such a focus on public health and personal health and able to sort of field those questions from their subscribers, what are your concerns around public health information, especially you were the Secretary of State for Rhode Island through the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, so we'd love to get your thoughts on this.
No, absolutely. No, what Madeline is calling attention to is fantastic. And I would say that we need greater funding of these kinds of efforts. They're not cheap. This is not like putting stuff up on a website or sending out texts by bots. This is actually answering people's questions and having those dialogues at a very granular level. And so that costs money. And so we need to make sure, and now I'm going to put my elected official hat, that money is being put into these efforts, either by the philanthropic sector or by the governmental sectors, to help promote accurate, sort of information getting to various communities. We need greater funding of centers of research, like at UConn, the Institute for Latino, Caribbean, and Latin American Studies, because that's where the research is happening that can then help combat this disinformation and misinformation. And finally, we need to put social media companies on watch. and on call, as well as governmental offices. The same things that you're doing for your English language dominant communities, you need to be also doing that for other communities in other languages. It is absolutely essential that we get equal distribution of resources to combat dis and malinformation. Thanks.
And Charles, with what both Nellie and Madeline shared, have you seen this to be true in Connecticut, that misinformation is best countered locally or individually?
So I've been thinking about this because this is a great conversation that's helpful for me. But one thing that I don't think we have talked, and it's something I've been sort of struggling with, we also have a problem with ideological thinking. A lot of our community members, a lot of Latinos and Puerto Ricans, just they're not interested in alternative views. Sure. And as part of this communication strategy, we also have to address the ideological resistance. Some people do embrace some of these sort of positions that are not necessarily helpful for the community. So yeah, we've seen that. We need more resources, but we also have to target the ideological thinking among some of the members of the community.
Right, and really quickly,
Charles,
go for it.
Sorry, I just want to
30
say
seconds.
That's actually not something that's just for Latinos.
It's across the board.
We have a problem of ideological lack of civility in listening to others. And I do urge you to look at the great work that the University of Rhode Island is doing with their media lab in terms of media literacy and holding conversations with people of disparate viewpoints, community conversations that help people practice this art of listening to alternative points of view.
And yes. Madeline, with what both Nellie and Charles just shared, would love to get your final thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'm so glad that Nellie ended with a plug for funding. Something that's really interesting about El Tímpano is one of our biggest supporters, and that has really allowed us to grow and provide this service during the pandemic has been our local public health department, because they realized that if they wanted to reach communities most vulnerable to COVID-19, which is Black and Brown residents, they needed to go through trusted messengers. And so there are many justified reasons that communities of color don't trust the government. For the communities El Tímpano serves, the primary reason is that, a lot of immigrants simply don't have a relationship to begin with, or a trusted relationship with government institutions or medical professionals. And so I love this approach that our local public health department has taken to partner, to really work in partnership with trusted messengers to be able to provide trusted and verified information to residents.
Well, thank you very much for that. You've been listening to Madeline Baer, who's the founding director of El Tímpano. Thank you so much, Madeline, for being with us today.
Thank you.
As well as Nellie Gorbea, who's a visiting senior fellow on the cybersecurity at the Pell Center. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, and thank you to Connecticut Public Radio for focusing on this very important topic. And so increased funding goes for public radio as well.
Well, thanks for that plug. We are very happy to hear that. And as well as UConn's Dr. Charles Venator, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Katie Pellico. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.